Tax is kind of an avenue to a great passion of mine in life, which is helping people. So I really enjoy meeting people and helping them solve their problems. And for me, I've used taxation as that avenue. As you know, everyone, the old saying goes, there's certainties in life of death and taxes. So for me, I've chosen the tax route as an avenue for me to pursue my passion and help people.
Thank you all for joining us today in another episode of Moving to Expatland, the journey to Singapore. My name's John Makarian and I'm the founder of the Expatland Global Network. Today's guest is Boon Tan from CST Accountants and Advisors in Singapore.
Australian born with Singapore heritage, Boon provides specialist tax advice to CST's clients in relation to corporate tax and inbound, outbound tax matters for individuals entering Singapore and founders of companies entering Singapore. Prior to commencing at CST Tax in 2012, Boon spent 12 years at various international accounting firms where he managed family groups dealing with Australian tax compliance for foreign subsidiaries. In 2016, Boon made the move overseas to head up to CST's Singapore office. His combined personal and professional background means he's ideally positioned to provide the specialist tax advice for both inbound and outbound tax matters in Singapore. It's my great pleasure to welcome Boon Tan to our show today. Hello, Boon.
Thanks for having me, John. Good morning.
How are you?
Good.
That's good. Well, you might start by telling us how you got into tax, Boon.
I guess tax is kind of an avenue to a great passion of mine in life, which is helping people. So I really enjoy meeting people and helping them solve their problems. And for me, I've used taxation as that avenue. As you know, everyone, the old saying goes, there's certainties in life of death and taxes. So for me, I've chosen the tax route as an avenue for me to pursue my passion and help people.
That's better. Yeah. Okay. And who did you first start with?
In Sydney, as a graduate in 2000, during the Olympic year in Sydney, I started at a small boutique firm in North Sydney, small 3-partner firm, and that's where I kind of learnt accounting skills and tax skills from an Australian perspective for individuals and companies.
Yeah. And did you think at that time you yourself would move to Singapore and be an expat?
Absolutely no chance. Absolutely no chance. My dreams and aspirations were to, probably naively, that I'd found my perfect job at the age of 21, and I was only ever going to have one job. So thinking back at 21-year-old me sitting there on the 2nd of January starting work in North Sydney to where I am today talking to you from Singapore is chalk and cheese, man.
Well, that's often the way, isn't it? But
It is.
And tell us a bit about life in Singapore as an expat Australian.
It's been a fabulous experience. We've been here now for coming into our 6th year. My son Jared was 8 months when we moved up, and really for him this is home. He may have been born in Sydney, but he certainly doesn't know much about Sydney other than the fact that his grandparents and his aunties and uncles and cousins are all there. But for him, life is Singapore. And for my wife, Christina, and I, Singapore's really been a great experience for us. First time for me living out of home, so a different experience again.
Yeah.
But certainly it's been one that's been life-changing. Singapore is very easy city for an expat to live in, and really for an expat experience 101. It's been very easy, very smooth. English obviously being one of the 4 main languages, so communication's not an issue. But given, as you've alluded to in the intro, my heritage is from this part of the world, so I'm fortunate enough to be able to speak some of the local dialect enough to get around. So it's been a really great experience.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting point that you make, which is adjusting to life in a new place and having the heritage, as you say, but I guess you still have to make some adjustments when you arrive. So what would you say for someone who's moving to Singapore are the most challenging aspects of moving that you found?
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right, John. I mean, given my cultural background, I did think the move was going to be a lot more easier, and having visited the country and having relatives here, a number of years in the past before making the relocation, I was really quite surprised and taken aback as to, especially from as you said, the cultural perspective and a work perspective, the differences between here and in Australia.
Yeah.
And it's simple things like, you know, the Asian culture of deference to someone senior above you. I don't do anything until you tell me to. And it took a while for me to understand that, okay, that's just the culture,
Mm.
right? It's
Mm-hmm.
actually a sign of respect more than anything else. It's not a sign of a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of drive of the individual. It's certainly a respectful approach. And it's something you see not, all over the culture and society. You go to train stations, jump on an MRT, public transport, and you see that kind of deference to the customer is the person I'm serving. So, listening, taking on board what they want to try and to serve their needs. It does take some time, but once you get used to it, you realize that, it does make things easier.
No, well, that's good. But I imagine then again, you've got to be able to probably understand that they may not raise issues with you that you might have raised with you in other work environments where you've come from. So how do you sometimes pull out the fact that they may not actually think what you're doing is the right way as a leader then?
Sure, that's a very good point. And I guess it's understanding a bit of the nuances in the culture as well. This is a society that is very much, I guess, rules based. Okay.
Yeah.
So, for example, doing a set of financial statements in Singapore, to use accounting analogy for a moment, they are reportable. They do need to be in the format of the financial standards. And sometimes, you know, issues arise where a client may not want something disclosed or something disclosed differently. It is a challenge, but it's a bit of explanation and providing some commercial insight as well as to why, okay, whilst the standards are saying we need to do A, B, and C, from a client perspective, and if you think about the risk and the commercial element of it, we should actually do X, Y, and Z. And if you really step back and think about it and stop for a minute, you'll see that X, Y, and Z is actually not totally unrelated or drastically different to what the standards are looking for. It's just a different approach to presenting the information.
Yeah, so maybe give some thought to how you might adapt what's used in your home country to what Singaporean accounting or business standards might be. So, if you're a business person looking to set up in Singapore and move yourself, your family, and maybe some staff to Singapore, how does the business environment compare to what you were used to in Australia in terms of setting up business and doing business?
Setting up and starting up business here in Singapore is actually quite easier compared to back in Australia.
Oh,
And
cool.
I've actually,
Mm-hmm.
having helped a number of companies set up in Singapore, it's actually quite refreshing to hear the feedback that the community here, especially in the expat community, as you know, a lot of the expats here are small business owners themselves.
Mm.
And they are actually very supportive, especially of Australian, for example, coming up. I'm on a WhatsApp group with about 150 locals who are small business owners in the SME industry, and you will regularly see posts saying, "Hey guys, I've just arrived. I'm living in this area. Would love to catch up for a drink. And by the way, looking for some legal advice. Anyone you recommend?" And without hesitation, you'll get a dozen different responses saying, "Hey, go use this person. I've used this person really, often, and they're really good, and they'll be able to help you."
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very supportive
Mm-hmm.
culture here.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. And I guess in terms of the tax system now, maybe you could talk about complexity of getting it right in terms of tax and dealing with some tax challenges, foreign jurisdiction and then the local jurisdiction. Maybe touch on that for us.
Yeah, sure. So the Singapore system is quite different or unique in the sense that it's a territorial tax system. And what that means is that the Singapore tax authorities will only tax income which is sourced in Singapore. Foreign income is therefore generally not taxed. So if you're an individual and expat individual, and you're coming to work for a big MNC, and you've still got your assets in your home jurisdiction, you can continue to earn income on that asset, and you won't be liable to tax in Singapore because it's not sourced in Singapore. It's foreign income.
I get it. So Boon mentioned MNC, multinational corporation, just for those who slipped into the jargon there, which accountants tend to do now and again, right, Boon?
Absolutely. Bad habits die hard.
If I sell a house in my home country or some shares, are you saying that probably as an individual not taxable in Singapore?
Correct. Yes, it won't be
Right.
taxable in
Okay.
Singapore. The other point to note as well is domestically in Singapore, there is no capital gains tax regime.
Okay.
You can set up a share portfolio, for example, locally with a private bank. A lot of expats will have, or a financial planner locally, and set up a share portfolio. And any disposals of those shares, which would be capital gains, are not taxable.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's good to know. So let's just touch on a little bit about how people often say, oh, I set up a company in Singapore. But does it mean if anyone sets up a company in Singapore, they will just pay tax on the income that company generates? Or what does a company got to do or not do to pay Singapore tax?
Yeah, so Singapore tax for a company is based on residency. Only resident companies in Singapore pay tax on their income sourced not only domestically but internationally. And I think that's an important point, John, just to point out that whilst an individual is not taxed on their foreign income, companies can be taxed on foreign income. If a company generates income from sales overseas, and remits it back to Singapore, that will still be taxable. But another big issue is also the issue of tax residency for a company. And under the Singapore system, the issue is control and management. So Singapore has a very
Okay, what does that
wide,
mean?
yeah. So control and management from a Singapore perspective is specifically where the board of directors have their meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And what the Singapore tax system want to see is that the board meetings are held physically, preferably, or the majority of board directors on the board are in physically in Singapore having the meeting.
Interesting. So, I mean, we have Zoom these days, and we're talking on a conference now. So, if I set up a Singapore company and the directors in Norway or the other ones in London or the US, how do we have these physical meetings now during COVID times and stuff?
Well, there are obviously some concessions regarding the situations we're going through now, but irregardless of that, there is still a need for a Singapore company to have some level of substance, economic substance here.
Right.
So it means that there needs to be a presence, be it a small company with people that are running, could be a sales team, could be a senior member of sales. But that ideally would then mean that that individual member is also a member on the board for the Singapore company specifically. Because what we're trying to show, or the key point to show the tax authorities to get a certificate of residency, and that is an important point I'll come back to in a minute, is that the company is being run and operated at a board strategic level in Singapore and not outside of Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why we want a certificate of residency, or why that is important, is that Singapore's got a very large network of double tax agreements. And that's very important, or very favorable for Singapore companies who do a lot of international work. And it means that if we're able to get the Singapore tax authorities to issue a certificate of residency for the Singapore company,
Mm-hmm.
where we get some comfort in being able to apply the double tax treaty, which often means that sales made by the company in a foreign jurisdiction are only taxable in Singapore rather than that foreign jurisdiction.
So this certificate is quite valuable then.
It is extremely valuable because often when clients try to apply concessions under the double tax agreement, the local authority will ask for proof that the company is a resident of Singapore before they will grant that concessional rate of tax.
And so that is, very interesting for an entrepreneur or business person trying to set up in Singapore. Now, if we look at some of the other incentives for a company moving to Singapore, do you have any advice or guidance to share there for people moving?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first one that I've alluded to is obviously the double tax agreement network that Singapore does have a very large number of agreements in place with a lot of different jurisdictions around the world, which a lot of other countries don't have. So that certainly is advantageous for Singapore in terms of setting up a global footprint for a business,
Yeah,
being able to know that you've got that. Singapore is also a very strong intellectual property hub. So there are a lot of companies, global companies, who set up entities in Singapore to hold
yeah,
intellectual property. And the reason being that from a legislative perspective, the legislation in Singapore is designed in a way to provide security and certainty for holders of IP in Singapore. That
yeah.
makes it a very popular jurisdiction. And Singapore being, an island nation is obviously keen on developing its economic base. So there are government agencies like the Economic Development Board of Singapore, Enterprise Singapore, which are there statutory bodies which are there to help and encourage inbound investment into the country. And that means that there are certain sectors within the industry, finance, fintech, Web3 being a number of industries which are currently the focus of these statutory bodies, where these members of EDB and Enterprise Singapore are out there in the international market saying, hey, Singapore would love to have you set up your global headquarters here and provide some incentive, be it tax, be it support for hiring of foreign manpower, things like that. So if you're thinking of a place to set up globally, there are a lot of commercial and economic reasons to really have a serious think about Singapore.
And does CST Accountants and Advisors help people with some of these government entry programs?
Absolutely, yeah. So over the years, we've developed a relationship with key individuals in certain departments in both Enterprise Singapore and the Economic Development Board. So we are able to, make approaches to those contacts on behalf of our clients to see what support and assistance the government bodies are able to provide our clients as they come into to set up in Singapore.
And in terms of the Expatland team that you have, the E team in Singapore,
Yeah.
tell us, how did you get attracted to that concept?
Well, I guess, John, going back to the introduction where my real passion in life is helping people, the E team was very attractive in terms of the concept because it meant that outside of my area of expertise being tax and accounting, I was able to help my clients further. So going through the journey and experience myself of arriving in Singapore, I knew that it wasn't easy. And as I mentioned, I already thought I had a cultural affinity and background to this part of the world already, and I still found it difficult. So if someone who doesn't have that background that I have, can only imagine how difficult it would be. So obviously being able to then help my clients and friends alike through the E-team by introducing a real estate agent to help them find a place to live, and being able to, and having that personal relationship with the real estate agent to be able to give them a briefing before the first meeting with the client.
And so, could you give us an example of how you might help someone who reaches out to Charlie on relocation or you on tax, how that might actually work in practice?
Yes. So first things first is always a initial meeting. Part of the journey is always to have a first up meeting to understand the client needs, to understand the client's objectives.
Hmm.
So it could be a business owner. I think of a client example where they reached out and said, look, we're looking to set up a subsidiary in Singapore, and we also want to send someone up, send a senior employee up. So, okay, let's have a chat. Let's find out, understand, what are you trying to achieve with this Singapore company?
Hmm.
Well, we're looking to expand further into Asia. So Singapore is a great hub to place our sales director. So it was a sales director being relocated up from Melbourne.
Hmm.
Okay, understanding, okay, well, therefore you're going to have an employee who's going to be traveling a lot. We need an employment pass. So this, introductions to Benjamin Echelon. So this employee is going to move. So obviously we need to get a remove list. So introduction to Charlie, who can then coordinate the relocation and the move from in this case, it was Melbourne up to Singapore, and then getting the introduction to the employee themselves personally. And again, having another call, yes, I'm the director. My husband and my 2 kids are coming up. The children are this age. Okay, so they need schooling. What kind of schooling are you thinking about? What introductions can we make to help you get into school, get the kids into school? Introduction to the real estate agent. By the way, my daughter is going through her braces. Do you know anyone that might be able to take that on? Oh, absolutely. So we've got Sean and the expat dental team.
Well, that's a good example.
Yeah,
People often don't tend to think about the expat dentist, but you have access to one of those on your team.
absolutely. Absolutely. And obviously, when business opportunities come up, you can't suddenly go, well, we'll wait the 8 or 9 months to get your braces done before we move. It doesn't really work that way. So being able to then go, listen, seamless transition. Let's get your dentist in Melbourne to talk to Sean and the expat dental team, just to give them the briefing of where things are at, so that your daughter can continue with that process of getting her braces done.
And do you guys have catch up regularly, or do you have meetings? How does your e-team function?
Yeah, so meetings are absolutely important. One of the key elements of our E-team is the relationships between each of the teams. So we have meetings every 6 weeks where everyone, be it Zoom at the moment, but preferably, in the past, we would all get together around the table, get some coffee, and just really talk about what market issues they're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Different people will have a different entry point into expat life, coming in and out, and then what opportunities are available. And really often, when people meet each other in person and talk, actually the client I spoke to yesterday, or the prospect I spoke to yesterday, actually needs your services. I'll make sure I'll link you up. Sometimes it's a good, jogger of those kinds of relationships and interactions as well when we meet together.
Cool. Now, away from work, I hear you're a bit of a foodie. Maybe you can share some of the great food insights of Singapore. And
Yeah, well, Singapore is a great food hub, and really the good thing about Singapore is that you can really find fantastic food at any budget you want.
yeah,
So if you want your high end, you can go to a 3-hat restaurant in the Michelin book and pay $500 for a meal and a wine degustation pairing.
yeah.
Or you could just walk down the road to your local hawker center and get some local cuisine at $2 a pop.
And I guess the shopping culture is brilliant as well. So maybe tell people a bit about that.
Yeah. A lot of high-end boutiques and global brands are available here in Singapore. There are, Orchard Road is effectively shopping centers side by side for 6 or 7 blocks. Think, High Street in New York, or down Oxford Street in London, that kind of shopping district. So, but again, if you're looking for local trinkets and things like that, just go down to your local markets, and again, you can pick that up. Singapore is great like that. You can really live the way you want to live.
Wow, that's really great.
Yeah, you do have a choice of what you want, be it food, be it living, be it buying product. It's great in that sense.
And do you see yourself there for a while longer yet? You've said 6 years. How are you feeling about life in expat land? Because I know a lot of people come sometimes for 2 years and end up staying for 10. How do you think that applies?
I mean, for me and my family, I think we came with no set target to leave. It was more about how we're going to find life. It was a new experience, new journey for us that we'd never been on before.
Yeah.
And I have to say, been incredibly rewarding for me, for my career, for me as a individual, and for my family as well. So if you ask me that question today, the answer is we haven't even thought about when we're going to leave. We're having too much fun to leave.
Well, that's probably a great point to end. And thank you, Boon. I think you've shown listeners a really welcoming picture of Singapore and given a lot of helpful hints and tips today. So it's really great to have had you aboard. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me, John.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Moving to Expatland, the journey to Singapore. To find out more about how the Expatland Global Network can help you please visit expatland.com. Enjoy the journey.